G'day guys, as promised, here is my detailed breakdown of the way that the new Chaos Space Marines are going to function in the Arks of Omen meta. This is something that I've been sitting on for a couple of days. I wanted to digest it and come up with some really robust thoughts on this. I didn't want to just jump the gun like a lot of people have done online. I wanted to make sure that this was well-rounded. And I'm going to supplement this by not only sharing my thoughts on what this means for Chaos Space Marines, but sharing a few potential highly competitive lists for Chaos Space Marines in this new Arks of Omen detachment with the new points costs and the new secondaries all factored in. So stick around to the end of the video to see these new exciting competitive Chaos Space Marine lists. But first, let's get into breaking down the goods, the bads, this and that's of Arks of Omen from the perspective of Chaos Space Marine players.
Look for the Blood God.
Alrighty guys, in this video we're going to do a breakdown of the good news for the Chaos Space Marine players, the bad news for Chaos Space Marine players, all of the points cost changes, all of the changes to the way that our secondaries function, and then some deep dives on some other considerations that Chaos Space Marine players are going to need to think about whilst approaching the Arks of Omen season. And then we're going to round the video out with a couple of lists that I think are going to be seriously competitively viable. So let's get into the pros and cons first. Alright, so the good news is that we can get a free allied detachment. We have no more mandatory troops. Troops are no longer capped at 6 units. Lords of War gain Legion traits, and we have the ability to take 4 HQ slots. Alright, so straight out the gate, that's some really powerful advantages that we have now that we didn't have previously, you know. Not having to take troops if you don't want to is really strong for the legions that don't have really competitively viable troops. But for the legions that do have competitively viable troops, I'm looking at you, Emperor's Children, they can now take more than 6. So either way, you've got that freedom, which is really, really good for the Chaos Space Marine legions. You know, being able to take allied detachments without having to spend CP means we can bring in those War Dogs as allies, or we can bring in Demons as allies, and it's not going to break the bank. We can still spend all of our CP buffing our characters to high hell, and that's one of the things our characters do best. So one of the strongest parts of our faction just got stronger. And there's plenty of other things, Lords of War getting Legion traits, these are all really, really powerful things that we didn't have previously. So even though there were some nerfs thrown our way, there's some serious buffs thrown our way as well. But let's talk about the nerfs. Alright, so the bad news is we lost Armor of Contempt, Helldrakes have to start in reserves, the Iron Warrior's Legion trait was nerfed, the Creations of Bile only fight back on a 4+ now, and Allied Flamers need to roll to hit. Alright, so losing Armor of Contempt hurts. However, if you're running things like the Big Chaos Terminator build, which was very, very popular before this, it's actually not that big of a nerf because a lot of the durability of that unit came from the fact that it's really hard to hit, it's really hard to wound, and it has a Feel No Pain save, which can't be modified. So those 3 things didn't change. The only part of that multi-layered defense that changed was your armor save potentially in some instances got 1 worse. That's actually not that big of a deal, and this is why we create multi-layered defenses. Some of the other nerfs, things like Helldrakes having to start in reserves, who cares, we weren't running Helldrakes anyway. You know, a lot of the other nerfs are very easy to navigate around, and in my opinion, aren't that big of a deal for the Chaos Space Marines. But the point costs, that's somewhere where we did get hit. So we got 3 things increase in points cost. So Abaddon went up 50 points, which is a 16.66% increase. Terminators went up 3 points per model, which is a 9% increase, and the Mark of Slaanesh went up 5 points, which is a 33% increase. For decreases, we got free war gear on Legionaries, characters, and many vehicles, which is very strong, and Plague Marines went down 2 points, which is an 11-point decrease. Alright, so all in all, yes, we did get some points hikes, and yes, they were on our particularly popular and competitive units like Abaddons and the Terminators, but we also got some points decreases which will likely offset that. Now, we didn't get the broad points decreases that the Loyalist Space Marines got, which is disappointing. However, we were already so much better than them. We have things like Illusory Supplication that they could only dream of. We have the Black Rune of Damnation that they could only dream of. We have things like the Disco Lord and the Demon Prince, which are absolutely amazing units. We also have some really powerful secondaries. We have really powerful units like Chosen. So I think all in all, we didn't really need those sweeping points reductions that they did. And if anything, it just brings them up to par with us. It doesn't necessarily make us that much worse. And on top of that, we did get sweeping points reductions on things like the Legionaries, where an average unit of 5 goes from 90 points, gets about 45 points worth of free war gear if you fully kit them out, which obviously you do because it's free. So those Legionaries got significantly better. So I think all in all, these points cost changes aren't that big of a deal. And if you were running a list that had Abaddon and the big Terminator brick and then some other units around it, you realistically only lost maybe 70 to 100 points, depending on your loadout, right? That's not that big of a deal. That's just like a couple units of cultists you no longer have, that sort of thing. So if you were losing games by that close of a margin, that's a problem. But in my experience, most of the games that I was winning, I was crushing my opponent. And if I didn't have a couple units of cultists, I would still crush my opponent, you know? If I had to drop one of the Decimators out of my Black Legion list, then that actually saves me more points than I've just lost. So then I have more points to spend on an additional unit of Legionaries or something like that. My list actually doesn't get much weaker, you know? But it still does all this massive damage. The Terminators are still an absolute pain in the ass to kill. So I think these points costs aren't as big of a deal as a lot of people are making them out to be. Alright, now let's talk about the new secondaries, because this was previously one of the biggest weaknesses for all Chaos Space Marine players, and it's now one of our biggest strengths. So behind enemy lines is now much easier to score and is much stronger. All of the generic secondaries can generate command points if you kill units or do things with your troops. Rise to Glory now scores in the shooting and melee, and is worth more victory points. The Long War is now capped at 4 victory points. Emperor's Children is now one of the most powerful secondaries in the game and is almost an auto 15 points. And the Alpha Legion Subvert at the end of their turn, which is huge, and it pairs with the new and improved Behind Enemy Lines. So there's no denying that one of the weaknesses we had previously was our secondary game was very weak. We almost always won the fight, and we almost always dominated on things like primary, but we struggled to score those secondary points. Now, that's actually somewhat inverted and balanced out. We're now much easier to get those secondaries, but slightly harder to win the primary. So I think this is net a very, very good thing for the Chaos Space Marines. The Alpha Legion secondary, for example, you're able to move up in one turn, move onto an objective, and flip it. And now your opponent can never score points off that, which means your ability to score primary just goes through the roof because you're going to have a much easier time controlling more than them when there's 5 objectives and they can only score points off 4 of them. That's so strong. So I think that, and the fact that that pairs with the new upgraded Behind Enemy Lines, which Chaos Space Marines have some really, really cool tricks on how they can get behind enemy line points really easily and really fast, means that Chaos Space Marines now have a very strong secondary game and a very strong army. So this is a very good combo for the Chaos Space Marine players out there. Alright, so there's a few other considerations. Loyalist Marines got buffed, but they are still just Marines. They were not a threat before, and they're not likely to be that big of a threat now. Our secondaries were our biggest challenge, and that is now resolved. Tyranids, Tau, Harlequins, and Sisters of Battle all got way more severe nerfs than we did, and they were previously some of our biggest threats. And our damage dealers are still strong. I think the biggest one here that a lot of people are overlooking and not considering is the fact that a lot of the things that threatened us before just got seriously nerfed. And as a result, we now have a much easier path to victory. Yes, the Space Marines are very powerful now, and there's something we're going to have to contend with, but we're going to be able to do that a lot easier because we're not going to have to be fighting off Tyranids and Harlequins and Sisters of Battle and all this sort of shit. We're going to be able to go, cool, it's a lot easier to beat all of those things. We were already really strong into a lot of other factions like Eldari and Tau, and now, really, the only thing we need to consider is how do we go about beating the Marines, which gives us a very clear vision and it gives us very clear instructions when writing our list. We need to write it so that we have the tools to kill Space Marines and to survive the Space Marines, which is easy to do when you go, cool, we're just going to have things in Deep Strike. We're going to have Black Legion Terminators that can hide behind a wall where they can't be shot and then teleport in, do all their damage. You know, those Alpha Strike moments where we're just going to deny the Space Marines the ability to bring their guns to bear, to bring their combat to bear. And the fact that they also lost Armor of Contempt means that things like our Terminators with their bolters can go to AP1 with a stratagem, can get reroll hits and wounds from Abaddon. That kills a ton of Marines, you know, and then they go in and charge with their recursive weapons, kills a ton more Marines. So I think both sides are now more likely to die when they engage with each other, but we're more likely to be able to pick when that engagement happens, which is a really strong advantage to us. Even though they're going to have more units to play with, I think we're going to have the advantage in that our units are just better than theirs. Alrighty, so that's more or less my thoughts on how Arks of Omen is going to affect Chaos Space Marines specifically. Now I want to talk about two different lists that I think have the legs to be very, very powerful competitively. We're going to break down the list, then I'm going to do a summary of what secondaries this list is designed to achieve and how you would go about achieving them, and what sort of predicted scores you can expect running a list like this. So let's get into the first one, which is an Emperor's Children list. Alright, so we have a Chaos Lord. He has a Power Fist, Thunderhammer, the Rapacious Demon Weapon, and the Mark of Slanesh. Then we have a Master of Possessions, Liber Hereticus, Mutated Invigoration, Pact of Flesh, and Mark of Slanesh. Then we have 6 units of Noise Marines, with a Blast Master in each one, Chain Swords in each one, a Power Fist and an Icon on the champion. And then we have a 7th unit of Noise Marines, which is 8 Noise Marines total. 1 has a Blast Master, 6 have Sonic Blasters, and then a champion has a Power Fist and an Icon. That unit of 8 goes in a Dreadclaw with both of the characters. Then we have 3 units of a single Obliterator and 3 Rhinos, each of which will hold 2x5 Noise Marines. Alright, so as you can see, this list is heavily themed around the Noise Marines. Now, one of the reasons the Noise Marines are really, really good, specifically in Arks of Omen, is A, you can take more than 6 units of them, and they're a really strong unit. The reason they're a really strong unit is because they're troops, which means if you take any of the primary or the secondaries that are your default one, you're going to be scoring command points by achieving that victory point. They also have Mark of Slanesh built into their cost. So that points cost nerf to Mark of Slanesh actually doesn't impact the Noise Marines. They didn't go up, which sort of means they kind of got a buff. And then on top of that, they bring Blast Masters, which are an amazingly efficient weapon at killing Space Marines. That 4 damage is going to be really, really relevant when you're going into 3 wound models that have some kind of feel no pain save, or, you know, their version of a Delightful Agonies. Being able to just go, boop, 1 shot, 1 kill. If they bring things like Centurions, that's really good. And it also pairs really well into Knights and all of that sort of stuff. On top of that, the Sonic Blasters go to AP1 2 damage. That's amazing at clearing out Marines. So you've got a lot of different weapon profiles that are very effective at killing Marines, which is going to make Emperor's Children really, really strong. Not to mention, their characters are next level crazy. You've got army-wide fights first, and the ability to make your opponent fight last. So you can go in and pretty much always make sure that you're the one fighting first in every scenario. And that Lord with the Thunderhammer and the Power Fist is an absolute fucker. He smashes everything to death because he gets plus D3 attacks with each, and then he just goes in and does a massive amount of damage. So this is a really, really powerful list. It has a lot of scoring elements, but let's break down the specifics of the secondaries that you would take and how you would go about scoring these victory points. Alright, so the first one that you would take is behind enemy lines. You know, you have multiple units of a single Obliterator, which is very, very hard for your opponent to screen out. You put them in reserves, and then you can just drop 1 in every turn and score those victory points. You also have Noise Marines in a Dreadclaw, which can use Honor the Prince to get a turn 1 charge, which is arguably one of the most powerful turn 1 charges you can get. Then, late game, you have multiple units of Noise Marines with Rhinos that can support. So this is really, really easy to score very high on behind enemy lines. We then take Adorn the Canvas Eclectic. So all of the units have reasonable damage in both shooting and melee, which makes the killing criteria of this secondary really easy, because all you have to do is kill units and in melee, in shooting, and hold objectives. And the fact that you have multiple units that are all objective secured make holding more objectives than your opponent in your turn very, very easy, because you just have to walk onto the objective and you can take it off them. Finally, the Lord with the Thunderhammer and Fist is an insane beat stick, so he can easily duel enemy characters and kill them, which is the 3rd criteria for this secondary. Now, the third objective that we would take will depend. It'll either be assassinate or bring it down if your opponent has units that would give you a really high score on that, or it'll be raise the banners high if neither of them are strong. With lots and lots of units in Noise Marines, it's really, really good for raising the banners as well. And a few other notes to consider with the list is that you can use the Master of Possessions to kill a Noise Marine from the Dreadclaw and then resurrect it closer to the enemy. You combine this with Honor the Prince, and it's arguably the best charge in the game from reserves because you will pretty much get in automatically. Even against things like Infiltrators who can force you to drop 12 inches away, being able to kill a guy and then resurrect him closer, which happens at the end of the Psychic phase, or during the Psychic phase, means that you can actually end closer to them than that 12 inches and make those charges from your drop pod. Next, we have the list has 7 Blast Masters, which put out an insane amount of damage all game long and are great into Marines, as are the Sonic Blasters and the Power Fists that all hit on a 2+. And finally, army-wide fights first, and the ability to make enemies fight last means you are dominant in the fight phase, which is often what decides the primary objectives. Alright, so that rounds out my thoughts on the Emperor's Children list. I think this list has serious legs, and I've actually got a 3D printer over in the corner of the room there that's smashing out some Noise Marines right now, because these guys are going to be very, very powerful. Having multiple units is also really good because it allows you to be reactive and reflexive. You know, if one of your flanks starts going down, you can reinforce it with more units. You know, if your opponent moves in a certain way, you can act rapidly. Whereas if you just have one big anvil unit of Terminators, you need to play that unit perfectly, because if your opponent gets you out of position, you're out of position with your entire army. If your entire army is pivoted around that Terminator unit. Whereas with this, if you're out of position with a couple of pieces here and there, it doesn't matter because you've got more pieces to play with. So I think this is a really strong list, and I could definitely see this going undefeated at a GT. But it's not the only strong list Chaos Space Marines have access to. Let's have a look at an Alpha Legion list. You'll probably recognize this one. It's called the Subversionists. Alright, so this one is really absolutely capitalizing on the Arks of Omen changes. So we've got a Lord Discordant on Hellstalker with Flames of Spite and Ulok of the Black. Then we have a Demon Prince with Wings, Mark of Nurgle, Golax, and the Master of Diversions. Then we have 12 units of 5 Legionaries. Each one has an icon, Demon Blade, and Plasma Pistol on the Sergeant. There's a heavy chain axe in every one, and then there's a las cannon on every unit. Finally, we have 2x10 Warp Talons. So the loadouts on those Legionaries, you feel free to mix them up a little bit. You don't have to have all 12 with las cannons. You can put some melter guns on some, which are your aggressive ones that go forward, and las cannons on the ones that sit back. You can mix it up however you want to, but the core concept here is that we're going to have 12 units of Legionaries, and each one of these units gets roughly 45 points worth of free war gear. So 12 by 45, you don't need to be a mathematician to know, that's a fuckload of points worth of free war gear. And then on top of that, like with the Emperor's Children, these are all troops. Which means if you pick any of those primaries that are your standard, secondaries that are your standard default ones, you're going to be scoring really, really highly on those, and you're going to be generating command points as well as you do it. Alpha Legion also have the ability to put things that started on the table into strategic reserves. And with Arks of Omen, you can put units into strategic reserves for free. So you could start with 4 or 5 units of las cannon Legionaries on the table, and then have 6 or 7 that are in strat reserves with melter guns coming in from table edges, and then if your opponent moves away from this one, you can just pop it back into strat reserves and bring it on this side of the table next turn. And you can just keep playing that game. Your opponent's never going to know where they're going to get hit from. Really, really powerful. And those Warp Talons, I'm not sure if you'll remember my Warp Talon Masterclass where I showed you an amazingly powerful trick that you can do with Alpha Legion Warp Talons, but they are an absolute critical part of this list, and they're going to do some really, really powerful stuff. But let's talk about the secondary objectives available to this list, how you would go about playing it, and how you would go about scoring very, very highly with an Alpha Legion list. Alright, so first of all, just like the Emperor's Children, you would take behind enemy lines. With multiple units of Legionaries, this can be reserved, they can come on from multiple edges, it's going to be very easy to get them into your opponent's deployment zone, and the Warp Talons can redeploy, then pre-game move, then move in their first turn, then charge, making it very, very easy for them to get into their opponent's deployment zone. So check out my Warp Talon Masterclass if you want to see specific examples of how this works, but it's very, very powerful. So that's how we score our behind enemy line points. The next secondary that we take is Infiltrate and Subvert, which is the Alpha Legion specific one. This is very easy to do early in the game with those Warp Talons on objectives close to your opponent. And then on a 3+, your opponent can never hold that objective marker again. So see the Alpha Legion Masterclass video that I did on a detailed breakdown for this objective on each mission. Then for our third objective, it'll either be Assassinate or Bring It Down if they score highly, like we said earlier, or Long War if they don't score well. With the changes to Long War, it's actually pretty good, and with multiple units of OBSEC, it shouldn't be hard for us to steal objectives out of underneath our opponents. Now, that Lord Discordant also hits insanely hard and will have plenty of Legionaries to screen him and protect him from direct damage. The Demon Prince with Golax is also an insane beatstick who's going to do massive damage for you. On top of that, the Warp Talons, they redeploy, then they pre-game move, guaranteeing turn 1 charges. And on top of that, they prevent enemy units from being able to fall back, locking them into combat while the Legionaries take over the table. So the way that this list is essentially going to work is you're going to have your 2 Warp Talons and your Demon Prince on the table, and then all 3 of them can redeploy after your opponent's finished deploying their army. So no matter where they deploy, you're going to redeploy in such a way that you can first turn move, then pre-game move, and charge them. Then, the beautiful thing here is the front unit of Warp Talons is going to charge and tie up all their combat. That stuff can't fall back in their turn, so they're going to be stuck in combat with those Warp Talons. Then, the second unit of Warp Talons is going to be able to subvert an objective. And basically what this does is as long as the objective marker, as long as you are within 6 inches of the opponent's deployment zone and within range of an objective marker, which most missions are going to have 2 or 3 objectives you can do this on, if that's the case, you can actually flip the objective marker, and now you can score victory points from it, but your opponent never can. That gives you an absolutely phenomenal advantage in the primary game and in the secondary game, because they can't raise banners on it or anything like that, because you need to control an objective in order to do so, and they're not going to be able to control it. So it's huge, and it really does make your opponent's life a living hell. So that Alpha Legion secondary, now that it triggers at the end of your turn instead of in your next command phase, makes it almost impossible for your opponent to stop you from doing it to at least one objective. So you can go in, you can flip one objective, and then all you have to do is get within 6 inches of your opponent's deployment zone to do an action with any one of those Legionnaire units, and you're getting victory points. Just victory points for days. So really easy to score high on that secondary. It pairs with behind enemy lines. It also pairs with the fact that your Warp Talons are going to be tying up your opponents, so they're not going to be able to shoot your Legionaries that are downrange, or they're going to be very difficult to do so. They're going to be busy dealing with this stuff while the Lord Discordant and the Demon Prince come up the midfield and tackle those hard-hitting targets. This list is crazy, and the amount of free war gear that it gets really does make it super, super powerful and super interesting. So this is just 2 lists out of the dozen of possible combinations that got so much more powerful with Arks of Omen. And I would argue that these 2 lists got bigger buffs than what the Space Marines think they did. They got some stuff cheap, but we also got some stuff cheap, and we were already very powerful, and we now have amazingly powerful secondaries. So with that being said, I think Chaos Space Marines are actually going to come out on top here. I think as long as we can, work out the fine details of this and navigate our way around the meta, I think this is going to be immensely powerful. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to enter the monthly competition to win an Angron, 3D printed Angron, all you have to do, join the Patreon. It's $4 a month, which is only $1 a week. And you get automatic entry into the competition, and you can win a 3D printed Angron value. It cost me a couple $100 to get. So yeah, join the competition, and that'll be posted out. Hopefully you'll be in your hands before the World Eaters Codex even hits the shelves, which will give you time to build it and paint it so that as soon as that Codex is in your hand, you're ready to hit the tabletop running with Angron and his legions of Berserkers. So if you want to enter that, if you want to find out more details, check out the links in the Patreon below. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Look for the Blood God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.
Do your objective markers ever get lost behind terrain or other models and become difficult to see? Do they ever get bumped and accidentally moved during a game? And do they ever spark arguments about distances? Well, not anymore. Introducing the blog for the blood god, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers. Made from the same material as astronaut suits, or maybe military equipment, or probably neither of those things, this 2mm thick neoprene synthetic rubber is tear resistant, water resistant, and is designed to last. But that's not all. The blog for the blood god, not even remotely patented neoprene objective markers come in a variety of different designs and styles to suit any faction represented in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. These objective markers are a perfect gift for yourself or a friend, and are a perfect way to flex and show your opponent that not only are you a smarter, cooler, and better 40k player than them, but you also have more disposable income than they do. For the low price of $25, you'll get not one, not two, but 6 neoprene objective markers, perfectly designed for 9th edition Warhammer 40k. But wait, there's more. For a limited time only, people who sign up on Patreon to support Blog for the Blood God as a Skull Champion tier $5 per month member will gain access to a custom design service where I will design a unique logo to support their gaming club, like the one I did to the left here for the Potato Farmers local gaming club here in Melbourne. Follow the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today.